It was a promise made in the innocence of childhood, back when the world seemed like a simpler place and the only thing that mattered was playtime and making friends. When Lily and Jake were both just 4 years old, sitting on the colorful rug of their preschool classroom, their teacher had asked each child to share something special about themselves. Jake had looked at Lily, his best friend, with big brown eyes and a smile that seemed too serious for a boy his age. "I'm going to marry you one day," Jake had said, his little voice full of certainty. The whole class had laughed, not knowing that this moment, this silly declaration, would be the start of something much deeper. Lily, shy and sweet, had blushed and nodded as if it made perfect sense. They'd been inseparable since they could remember, sharing crayons, snacks, and the occasional nap. To her, Jake was just another part of her little world, like her favorite stuffed bunny or the park down the street. His promise seemed innocent enough, the kind of thing a child might say without thinking much about it. But as the years passed, the promise faded into the background, just another funny memory from their childhood. They went on with their lives, different schools, different circles of friends, growing into teenagers, then young adults. They had both moved to different parts of the city, each caught up in their own world, but occasionally running into one another at the grocery store or on social media. They'd always exchange a quick smile, laugh, or a friendly, "Hey, remember when?" But neither of them ever expected that the promise from their preschool days would come to life, not in the way it did. Lily had been living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, juggling a demanding job and navigating her life one day at a time. She had grown into a beautiful young woman, but still, there was something missing. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was always a feeling that something was just out of reach. Jake, on the other hand, had gone off to college, joined a startup, and made a name for himself in the business world. His success was hard-earned, but despite his growing career, there was a sense of loneliness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He never stayed in one place too long, never allowed himself to get too close to anyone. His thoughts often wandered back to the girl he had promised to marry so many years ago. He'd always chalked it up to childhood innocence, a silly moment in time. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, when he was alone in his apartment or lying in bed, Jake would think about Lily. The thought would cross his mind, almost like a forgotten song playing softly in the background. What would it be like to see her again? To ask her, after all these years, if she still remembered the promise they made. One evening, everything changed. It had been a typical day for Jake, busy, full of meetings, and the usual hustle. He was walking down the street to grab a coffee when he passed by a small cafe. There, sitting at one of the tables outside, was Lily. It was as though time stood still for a moment. Jake stopped in his tracks. The familiar face, the soft smile, the way she sipped her coffee, lost in thought. Everything about her was the same, yet so different. Lily looked up just then, as if she felt the weight of his gaze. Her eyes met his, and a brief moment of recognition passed between them. "Jake," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and nostalgia. He smiled, unsure of what to say. The years had passed, but in that instant it felt like no time had passed at all. "Lily," he said, walking over to the table, "yes, it's been a long time." And just like that, they were back in each other's lives. It was like picking up a conversation they had left unfinished. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just the easy familiarity of childhood friends reuniting. Jake pulled out the chair across from Lily, taking a seat at the small cafe table. The sound of people chatting around them seemed distant, almost like background noise. All he could focus on was the familiar face in front of him, the same bright eyes, the same smile that had always made him feel at ease. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed her until this moment. "You look exactly the same," Jake said, his voice almost in disbelief. "I mean, I knew you would, but I don't know, it's like time hasn't touched you." Lily laughed softly, her cheeks flushing slightly. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me today." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes dancing with amusement. "And you, look at you, Mr. Successful Businessman. I always knew you'd do well. You were always the smart one, the one who was going places." Jake shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to compliments. "I don't know about that," he said, brushing it off. Worked hard, really hard. They both sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the awkwardness of the years apart melting away as they fell into the rhythm of an old friendship. The years had changed them, but the connection was still there, buried beneath the layers of life that had passed between them. So, Lily began, leaning in slightly, what brings you to this part of town? I thought you lived on the other side of the city. Jake hesitated for a moment. There were a lot of things he could say. About work, about his life, about all the things he'd been doing, but somehow, in that moment, all he could think of was the one thing that had been on his mind ever since they'd locked eyes, the promise he'd made all those years ago. I don't know, he admitted. I guess I was just thinking about you, about us. Lily raised an eyebrow, her expression softening. Us? Jake nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but when I saw you just now, I couldn't help but remember what I said to you all those years ago, back when we were kids in preschool. I promised I'd marry you one day. Lily blinked, and for a moment the surprise in her eyes took him aback. You remember that? She asked, her voice soft with curiosity. Of course I remember, Jake replied, his voice tinged with a touch of vulnerability. It's silly, I know, but when I saw you after all these years, I don't know, it felt like that promise wasn't just some childish thing, it felt real. Lily smiled, her eyes thoughtful as she looked down at her coffee cup. I remember that promise too, she said softly. But we were kids, Jake. We didn't really know what love was. We didn't know what it meant to be there for someone, to choose someone every day. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I know, but even now sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't drifted apart. What if we had stayed in each other's lives, instead of just letting it all slip away? The silence between them grew thicker, the air heavy with unspoken feelings. Lily looked up at him, her expression soft, but there was a question in her eyes, an uncertainty. You know, life doesn't always go the way we plan it. We grow, we change, we meet other people, we make mistakes. I know, Jake said, his voice low, but sometimes I can't shake the feeling that maybe fate brought us back together for a reason. Lily's smile faded slightly as she processed his words. Maybe, she said quietly, but sometimes life is more about timing than fate. Jake looked at her, the realization settling in. Maybe this wasn't about fulfilling an old promise. Maybe it was about something deeper, something more real than they could have understood as kids. The moment lingered between them, both Jake and Lily lost in their own thoughts. The promise of their childhood, so simple and innocent, now felt like a distant echo, a fragment of a life that no longer existed. And yet, there was something undeniably familiar in this meeting, something that made it feel as though no time had passed at all. Lily broke the silence first, her voice gentle. You're right, Jake. Life doesn't always follow the plan. We can't go back to those days, no matter how much we wish we could. She paused, glancing at him with a sad but understanding smile. But that doesn't mean we can't appreciate the journey we've both been on. Jake nodded, his eyes still locked on hers. I guess that's true. We've both lived our own lives, and maybe that's the way it was supposed to be. But it feels good to see you again. It feels like there's still... Lily looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her napkin nervously. I've thought about you a lot over the years, wondered what could have been if we hadn't lost touch. But I also know that we can't rewind time. Jake reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers for a moment, before gently brushing against it. I don't want to go back. I don't want to relive the past. I just want to know, could there still be a future for us? Could we start again? Not as who we were? Lily looked up, meeting his gaze with a mixture of hesitation and hope. For the first time since they'd met again, she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the same sincerity that had once made her believe in the promise of forever. She felt a flutter in her chest, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice full of vulnerability. "But I'm willing to see where it goes. We've both changed, Jake, and maybe, just maybe, we can build something new. A future, not based on promises from childhood, but on the people we are now." Jake smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of possibility. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd really like that." And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt the weight of their past lift. They were no longer bound by the innocence of childhood promises. Instead, they stood at the edge of something new, something uncertain, but full of potential.